Hello, today I'd like to talk to you about Bishop F4 and playing against it as black in the Queen's Gambit. Queen's Gambit with Bishop to F4, these days often called the Blackburn variation after Joseph Henry Blackburn, sometimes known as the Black Death, although I don't think his system is quite as dangerous as that. And there's a related system called the Harwitz attack, which bothered Paul Morphy quite a bit, although I don't think it's as dangerous as all that either. So let's have a little look at both of these. The position on the board here is the Blackburn variation. You can see that White has posted the bishop on F4 rather than G5. Now, what's the idea behind that? Well, G5 is a strong move and puts a lot of pressure on the black centre. But it may be that the final result of putting the bishop on G5 is that the bishops get swapped off, so that instead of so at some point this knight will hop out of the way and there'll be an exchange of knights and an exchange of bishops, and the whole thing will go a bit flat. Not quite in this position, I think, but nonetheless, that's the idea. Now, it would be in White's interest to keep more pieces on if black's a little bit cramped, and keep things a bit more complicated and a bit more less likely to fizzle out, even if bishop to G5 is a more forcing and a forceful move. Bishop F4 less threatening, but will get a small amount of pressure for longer. So that's the idea behind the Bishop F4 move. It's really only possible for White to play this on move 5 after black chooses bishop to E7, and now bishop F4 is fine. If White goes for it one move earlier, that's to say on move 4, and this was what Harwitz played against Morphy, and he eventually dodged out to the Dutch defence because of it. I actually think there are several defences against this which are pretty good. C5 I think is an equaliser, bishop to B4 I'm sure is an equaliser, and one idea which I think is nicely sort of rubbing it in White's face is bishop to D6, taking advantage of the fact that that bishop hadn't been moved yet. And of course, if takes E3, well, you know, black's ahead in development and it's looking okay. There is another idea in these positions, which is to play a knight on the B file to D7, and that's not too horrible an idea. We'll have a look at that in a second. But we'll pick up the main variation with knight to F3, which and again in this position I think black's got lots of other ways of dodging this. They can play well, bishop to B4 is the heading towards the Ragozin variation, not an obvious win for White by any means, complicated and difficult. There's C5, which is the semi-Tarrasch defence. I think White's got good chances against that, but not an easy game maybe. And there's C6, which is the semi-Slav defence, and again complicated, struggle in prospect. So if White wants this bishop to F4 variation, black really has to allow it in this line. However, it does crop up quite a lot with a different move order, which is to say, instead of knight to F6, black might want to play bishop to E7, and the reason for that is, if you come across the video on the exchange variation, quite a lot of the modern lines of the exchange variation, for example after knight F6 chop chop in the middle, and now the strongest lines probably involve bishop to G5 by White, E6 for example. Black might go C6, and bishop to D3 maybe castles, and white chooses, instead of knight to f3, putting the piece on e2. And that's considered the strongest way to play the exchange variation at the moment. So if the knight should go to e2, it shouldn't go to f3. So knight to f3 on move 4 in this position probably isn't that great, and you'd only play it maybe if you played it earlier, or to avoid some other sorts of things that black might play, like the Alban counter gambit. But after bishop to e7 on move 3, black's really asking white, well, what else have you got apart from knight to f3? And so you actually get the bishop to f4 variations quite commonly with this move order. Knight to f3 first, and now white plays bishop to f4, and that's why we see so much of the bishop to f4 line these days typically. Is because white plays this black plays this early bishop to e7 to avoid funny things in the exchange variation. So much by way of introduction. If we do get into this line with bishop to f4, what next? Well, I think there are some interesting lines you can dodge with. For example, castles e3, and now knight on b to d7 is an idea, when c5 is probably the strongest line. And there are some commonly played ideas along this sort of pattern. I don't really like that a lot for black, it's a bit passive. Instead of knight to bd7, pawn to b6, with the idea of fianchetto. Again, not super fond of this. You can get some swaps in, and you obtain this sort of hanging pawn structure if white takes on c5. And this is an okay way to play chess, and that may be fair enough. It's not by no means compulsory for white to take on d5 there. So those are two lines, knight bd7 and b6, which you might look at if you don't like what I'm going to recommend, which is to just castle and play c5 with less pressure on your centre. You can play c5 very happily. White usually forces black to lose a move by taking on c5, and then c takes d5 goes for a fairly equal isolated queen pawn position. So you have to be comfortable with that as black if you want to play this line. The main line is actually start queen c2, because part of the idea was to keep pieces on and keep it a bit chewier. Knight c6, and now the main lines go things like a3, queen a5, just being a bit active, and now rook d1 threatens the move b4 here. It didn't before because black could take, so in this position b4 doesn't work. And after rook d1, bishop e7, bishop e2 is a sort of positional main line where both sides just manoeuvre quietly, trying to get some sort of advantage. Black needs a plan to develop as usual. This poor old bishop on c8. The sharper lines after queen a5 involve castling long for white. Bishop e7 again because b4 was threatened, and now there are I'll put some games in the notes. G4 was the first idea I saw with this. Jonathan Spielman beat Nigel Short with it in a famous game. Black went back to the drawing board and found some ways of equalising, and then Kasparov started to play h4, also very sharp, and again there are some ways of equalising, we believe, and I'll put those in the notes as well. So these days white usually plays more quietly with king to b1. It's odd that castling works at all in this position, castling long, because if you castle you really want your king safe and not on a open file or in an area of the board where there's lots of activity going to happen for your opponent. So it's paradoxical, but nonetheless white has found they can get away with it because black's pieces aren't that actively placed. But we'll see how the game goes. This is a game between Van Velde and Van der Sterren between in Vikings in 1998. The knight comes back, takes with the bishop to develop. Queen f5 to take the queens off. Knight e4. Takes, and now e5, which solves the problem of the bishop. And this is about equal for black. Black's finally got their development sorted out. Things are starting to fizzle out a little bit in terms of swaps, but black eventually won this game. In fact, it's not obvious why at this point, but I'll stick the whole game in the notes that white just got a bit passive and was done to. So that's the bishop f4 line for black. You don't really only meet it if, as I say, you use an early bishop to e7. There is an idea here again for white. If for black, if you happen to know that black will want, there's an idea for black. If you happen to know that white would like to play a bishop to f4 system, knight on b to d7 on move 4 is reckoned to be quite good. The idea being that if bishop to f4, this is an idea of Anand, that bishop to f4 and now d takes c4 is a little bit awkward for white, because if e3, just hoping to hang on to the having to regain the pawn, and then b5 is the idea, and now of course knight takes b5, but check, knight d5, knight on 7 to b6, and castles, and this is quite a good setup for black. It's you've got plenty of activity, you've got plenty of development. There's some prospect of getting your perennial problem of this bishop on c8 on a decent square, and that's reckoned to be about equal, so that's not a bad equalising idea for black. Again, if we go back after bishop to f4 in a reply to knight bd7, d takes c4, and now e4, a little bit more aggressive, and but I think bishop to b4 again, queen c2, b5, a4 c6, and bishop to b7, not insisting on holding on to the pawn, but just making it more awkward for white than it usually is. And again, black's got decent development and some ideas of making trouble for white. So this knight bd7 idea I rather like. It means that white won't like to play necessarily bishop to f4. They can play bishop to g5, which I hope is getting you into lines that you already know. There is a possibility of playing off, switching very quickly into an exchange variation, and I hope the videos on the exchange variation will give you enough ideas to play against that, even if you have committed your queen's knight early to d7. Quite often you want to reply to the exchange variation with an early move bishop to f5, which is not really possible in this position. At least if you get away with it, please let me know.